Luke chapter 23, I want to go to verse 24. And it's talking about Jesus going to the cross here. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. And he released unto them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they desired, but they must have released Barabbas, but they delivered Jesus to their will. And they that led him away, they laid upon one Simon a Cyrenian coming out of the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. And there followed him a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him. And here's my text. But Jesus, turning unto them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves, and weep for your children. It's a very unusual statement that Jesus made while headed to Calvary to die for the sins of the world. If you will study the context of the scripture, you will find that Pilate was very uncertain in the verdict that he wanted to lay upon this Jesus of Nazareth. If you'll read the chapter, you'll find that in verse number 4, Pilate declared to all of them that he found no fault in Jesus at all. In verse 6 and 7, when he found out that Jesus was a Galilean, to get out from the pressure of making a decision, Pilate sends him to Herod. Because Pilate didn't have enough guts to make the right decision, he passed the responsibility on to somebody else. Verse number 16, they bring him back to Pilate, and Pilate went before the people and said, let me chastise him, and then I'll release him. Let me punish him. Let me scourge him. Let me hurt him, and then we'll just release him. So he goes from finding no fault to passing the blame to willing to scourge Jesus for nothing. But the people kept crying in the cobblestone street of Jerusalem outside the courthouse. They screamed at the top of their voice, let his blood be upon us and upon our children. And in verse number 24, Pilate yielded to the cries of the people. And though he was completely innocent, they sentenced Jesus to death. I want you to notice something in this chapter that stood out to me. It's kind of like a side note. In verse number 12, Pilate and Herod were enemies. They hated each other. They couldn't stand each other. But after they condemned Jesus, the Bible said, they become the best of friends. Because they found the common denominator is they hated righteousness. You know, it's amazing how some people never get along with some people at church until all of them leave. And then once all of them leave, they become best buddies on Facebook and they write each other every time. And the reason being is they have a common denominator. They hate this church. This church has not only gone on without them, it has done better without them. Now, Jesus is walking up Calvary's hillside. Let me have your imagination. He's walked outside the gated city in the walled city of Jerusalem. Behind him, the Bible said, he could hear the women wailing and lamenting his sufferings. The word bewailing and lamenting means they were actually moaning and groaning out loud. And while Jesus is headed up the cross outside the city of Jerusalem, he's going up Golgotha's hill. He hears the women behind him wailing and moaning. And he stops on his journey and turns around because they're following him, so he's got to turn around. And when he turns around, he looks in the faces of the people that are crying. But have you ever thought about when he looked in their faces, in the background of their faces was the city that Jesus loved, the city of Jerusalem. It was that same city at one time that Jesus climbed up on top of a mountain and looked out over Jerusalem and said, oh, Jerusalem, how I would have gathered you like a hen does her chicks, but you would not come. He loved Jerusalem. And when he turned around and looked at that walled city, there were two buildings that were stretched up to the sky, head and shoulders above every other building. And when those two buildings caught the eyes of Jesus, it was then he looked into the face of the women and said, please don't waste your time crying for me, but you better start crying for your children. What were those two buildings that looked in the mind and the eyes of Jesus at that moment like skyscrapers on a flat land? As he glanced over Jerusalem, I believe they were two buildings that stood out to his attention that made him say to those women, you better start crying for your kids, and you better do it now. I believe it was the courthouse that was being ruled by the Roman government, and I believe it was the church house, the temple that had been taken over by the Pharisees and the scribes. And when Jesus saw in his day that the government was going to go corrupt and that the church was going to go liberal, it was then that he looked at his followers and said, I'll tell you why you better be weeping for your kids, because this government's going to hell in a handbasket, and the church is so liberal they won't stand on anything anymore. If there's ever a generation of parents and grandparents that should be weeping at the feet of Jesus for a generation of young people, it is the day that we are living in. When I see the gutless government run by ruthless, heartless liberals, I know it's time to start weeping for the children. When I see a godless religion filled with fakes and cover-ups, it reminds me that it's time to weep for the children. Somebody said to me some time ago, why aren't more preachers preaching on politics and the corruption of the church? I'll tell you why. John preached against the corruption of politics. He said to Herod, it's not lawful for you to be with your brother Philip's wife. He was addressing governmental corruption, and they cut his head off. Jesus addressed religious corruption, and they crucified him on the cross. I tell you why preachers won't deal with this. They don't want to be rejected. They don't want to be slandered. They don't want to be cut off. They don't want to lose their buddies. And so they've shut up, and they've let a generation go to hell because we refuse to deal with the problems of our day. If you don't think it's not time to weep for our children, ladies and gentlemen, then there never will be. Would you allow me to deal with the corruption of these two entities? May I remind you that God instituted three things according to the Word of God. Number one, God instituted the home. God instituted a man and a woman to be married and to bring forth children. God instituted the home. God instituted government. And the governments were to fear God and eschew evil. And God instituted the church. You tell me the three things that the devil has unleashed on today more than ever before in these three categories. The home is under desperate attack. Our government is falling all to pieces. Our churches are a shell of what they used to be. So if we've ever needed a John the Baptist coming out of the wilderness with a locust in his mouth and honey in his hand and exposing the corruption of our day, it's the day we are living in now. Yet preachers act like they got a bunion on their tongue and a hernia on their lung. This country's gone to hell in a handbasket because of sympathetic, apologetic, weak-kneed, milquetoast, no backbone, compromising, mama called, daddy sent preachers that has let corruption have a heyday in our country. I want to mention two of the amenities that Jesus looked over the wall and saw and said, you better pray for your kids. You better pray because of the condition of the courthouse, the deterioration of the principles this nation was founded on has just about eroded to the point of no return. Every day we are waking up to a new America that is bent in the opposite direction of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Leaders that we would have laughed at their philosophy 10 years ago are now being recognized as the next upcoming national leaders. What used to be considered crazy ideas, outlandish, and even funny, has now become issues of debate in our houses of Congress. Allow me to mention a few of the stupid things that are being even considered and wasting airtime in our country. For somebody to say they're going to take all of our cars and airplanes is about the stupidest thing I have ever heard in my entire life. Nobody's getting my car. Have you thought about if you eliminate cars and planes because of emissions? Are you aware of the fact that ships burn the same emission gases as cars and trucks? So then if you do away with cars and planes and trucks, you must do away with ships, which means we can no longer travel and there can no longer be a worldwide trade system anymore. Did you ever think, even as a joke, you would hear the day when somebody in Congress would stand up and say cows put off too much hot air and gas, so we need to kill all the cattle? Now, I'm telling you, folks, we're laughing, but there's idiots that believe this. But here's what I want to say to Washington. There's a whole lot more hot air coming out of your mouth than there is coming out of that cow's rear end. Yeah. For those of you that didn't hear it, I said there's a whole lot more hot air coming out of the mouths of politicians than there is out of the rear end of cattle. I say do away with Washington and keep the beef. Now that's how stupid this country has become. Not long ago, the newly elected governor of the state of Virginia said in an open forum on a radio question-answer session about abortion. He is an OBGYN doctor. He said it is appropriate for the mother to carry that baby the 9 months, give birth to the baby, and if she hasn't decided whether she wants the baby or not, after it's been born, after its umbilical cord is cut, after it's taken from its mother, after it's breathed on its own, he said we would make the baby comfortable. The mother could speak to the doctor and the family and decide if she wants to keep it or not. If she does not want to keep the baby is injected and it dies. Now, my question to that bleeding heart liberal that should not even be a citizen of this country, much less the governor of the state of Virginia. You say give the mother time to talk to the doctor. How much time are you talking about? How much time should we allow? A minute? How about an hour? How about a whole 24 hours? How about a week? When does it become murder to kill a baby after it's been delivered alive from its mother's womb? God has never blessed a nation that has killed its young, and America is not going to be an exception to the rule. And I want to say to Virginia, you need to run that sucker out of town. Matter of fact, he likes shoe polish a whole lot more than he does being a governor. Amen. They ought to run him out of town. He is a murderer. When you kill children, you are guilty of murder in the sight of God. You're a murderer. Now, some of you are looking at me like, Brother Kid, you preached that a month ago. Why are you preaching it again? I tell you why. Because you pooched your lips out the first time, and you're pooching your lips out this time, and bless God, I'll preach it again next Sunday if you fool with me. Fences don't work, is what the liberals are now saying, as they go behind their fenced homes with gates and security guards. It's a funny thing, fences work in their yard, but it won't work in our country. I'm for aliens coming to this country. My family came to this country. There's a legal way to come to this country. But can you believe liberals are saying they're even for taking down the fences that are already up? A nation without borders ceases to be a nation. You are no longer a nation. You are just a piece of property. This is the nonsense that we're having to fool with coming out of the White House and out of the House of Representatives and also out of the Senate and out of the House. Gun control has never delivered a nation from crime, but it has delivered countries into communist reign and rule. I said to you years ago, there are 3 steps to a nation losing itself. Number 1 is humanism. that attacked our country back in the 60s. It infiltrated through our educational system. It was then that Madeline O'Hare and others got together and threw the Bible out of the public school system. Embraced evolution, that we came from monkeys. The way people act, sometimes I wonder where they did come from. And they embraced the fact of the Big Bang Theory, and they threw the Bible out. And ladies and gentlemen, for the first time, humanism was taught in our systems. They're also taught in our schools of higher learning, in colleges and universities, that you are your own God, and you can do what you want to do to make yourself happy in life. That is humanism. Once humanism is embraced in a country, it shifts to socialism. You can see that growing right before your very eyes. When you're wanting to make everybody on a level playing field, and when you want to penalize people for working and prosper low-down sorry people that will not get a job and work for a living, ladies and gentlemen, that is socialism. After humanism is embraced, after socialism is being taught, then it slips into communism. That is complete government control. They are now trying to tell us what our kids can eat and what they can't eat, what soda they can drink and they can't drink. Slowly but surely, they're taking the rights and the freedom of our country. And sad to say, preachers have set back. I got a cuss letter from a preacher this week, low down, yellow belly, livered nothing, and said this to me, said, you ought to leave politics alone. It doesn't have any use in the pulpit. Well, I wish you would tell Jeremiah that. I wish you would tell Isaiah that, because both of them suffered because they rose up of the corruption of their day and exposed the nastiness in the political world they were living in. Communism will take over a country and suffocate it and strangle it to death. I'm just about sick of what I see coming out of Washington between the stupid Democrats and the spineless Republicans. I don't know which ones make me sicker first. These Republicans that claim to be fundamental and claim to be dedicated and claim to have convictions, they're a bunch of mealy-mouthed good-for-nothings. They won't stand up for what's right. They're trying to please everybody. You know I'm telling it right. I tell you what I believe, and I hope the president gets a copy of this. I believe we need to issue term limits to every public office in the United States of America. There ought to be term limits. They ought to serve their time and get their tail out of Washington and go back to where they came from. It's amazing to me, if you look at the higher courts and both houses of representatives, if you didn't know better, you'd think it was a commercial for nursing homes. Now, I'm for taking care of old people, but 80-year-old people don't have any business being on the Supreme Court judge list. Bless God, they don't even know where they're at half the time. They sleep through half the trials. Somebody ought to throw them out. Am I preaching today? There ought to be term limits put on all of them. Can you believe just 2 weeks in office, just 2 weeks in office, a Muslim woman has already come out bashing Israel, trying to get America to turn their back on Israel. The statement she had made against this country and Israel, there should not even be a vote. They ought to throw her out of Washington right now while I'm preaching. Throw her out. Throw her out. What has happened to our country? They say that building a border wall is immoral, but killing babies is a choice. We spend untold billions and billions of dollars on illegals, while our veterans sit on the street corners and die waiting for medical help. And when Jesus saw the governmental filthiness and corruption, he said, you better start weeping for your kids. Now, some of us will make it through okay. But what our children and grandchildren are going to have to live through is unsurmountable to our comprehension. But that's not the one I wanted to get to. Some preachers will deal with that one. I want to talk about the corruption of the church house for a minute. Jesus knew the filthy and defiled leadership that was fast down at the temple to condemn others while they were covering their own sinful actions. 20 years ago, as an independent Baptist, I seen the movement begin to shift in a different direction. Out of concern, I've been an independent Baptist for 42 years. Out of concern, I went to what you would call some of our leading leaders and expressed to them the shift that I seen in a bad direction. Behind closed doors, their answer to me was this: you have to be quiet, because if you expose what's going on, you will hurt and harm the cause of Christ. In those 20 years where they have kept silent, the movement has shifted from just going to another direction to now being a cesspool of sin and perversion that is being covered up by preachers. Many preachers have come to me by the hundreds and spoken to me behind closed doors, but they are scared to death to come out in public and deal with the sin and the iniquity of the local church. They're afraid of not being able to preach at camp meetings anymore. They're afraid that they'll want their college degree back. They're afraid their clique won't fellowship with them. They're afraid of certain clubs and camps. And most of all, preachers are afraid of financial loss. By their own confession, several preachers that used to stand in this pulpit and preach have called me and said to me, quote, "I cannot afford to preach for you anymore," and have said they cannot preach in my pulpit because other preachers have got together and said, if you preach for Phil Kidd, you're no longer going to preach here. And because of financial gain, those men have canceled preaching at this church because they're more concerned about the applause of man than they are the approval of God. These are dirtbag hirelings that don't even deserve a casket when they die. This independent Baptist mess has pretended and covered up stuff for so long that I'm sure it even nauseates the devil himself. I'm saying things publicly that'll go around the world that many preachers are saying in private, but don't have enough guts and God in them to say it in public. I say to every, you know I'm telling it right. I'm saying to every preacher that's listening to this, because I'm sure your buddies are going to email it to you. You are a double-barrel hypocrite. If you cuss the corruption of America and you cover up the corruption of the church, you are a double-barrel, lily-livered hypocrite. And I, for one, have got my belly full of it. If it's right, it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong. It's sad. Sinners will write me and appreciate what I'm saying today more than Christians will. Preachers can't take preaching. That's why they can't sit under other preachers. They don't want being preached to. They know they're liberal. They know they're cowards. They know they've sold out. They know they've watered down. Now, to get more specific, I'm going to mention some of the issues that's bothering me. I'm not talking about Catholic priests raping kids. I'm not a Catholic. I'm not talking about Methodist women marrying Methodist women and becoming priests in the Methodist church. I'm not a Methodist. I'm not talking about Church of God people that are letting people shack up and be preachers. I'm not a Church of God. I'm not an Assembly of God. I'm not a Mormon. And I'm not a JW, so I don't want to talk about them. I want to talk about the filth in our movement. I'm going to tell you some of the things that's sickening me that somebody ought to be standing up against for the sake of our children. Number one, in the independent movement, they are notorious that if a staff falls in sin, they do not expose them. They relocate them to another ministry, usually in another state, and they cover for them. You know how many independent Baptist churches has had child molesters on their bus routes that have molested kids? The church has paid the families millions to keep their mouth shut, and then that church send that same bus worker to another church in another state to work with bus kids and continue their perversion in raping these kids. Do you know what I believe legal we ought to do? Every preacher that's ever covered for a child molester, you ought to be in prison. You ought to be locked up. You ought to have to suffer. I'm not talking about in general. I'm talking about specific situations. How about a youth director's wife getting pregnant by a 15-year-old boy? And they tell the boy and his parents he has to leave. Here's a youth director, his wife pregnant by a 15-year-old boy, and the pastor recommends him, the pastor of another church in another state, knowing his wife's pregnant by a 15-year-old boy in the church. I'm going to tell you something. That's statutory rape. She ought to go to jail. She ought to be in jail, what I'm preaching today. That's rape. But instead, he's pastoring a church while I'm preaching today. Oh, yeah, I know preachers come up and they'll text me, boy, I like that good, tough, straight preaching, till you preach on their buddies. And all of a sudden, if you say anything about one of their buddies, they can't have anything to do with you anymore because, you know, they're my buddy. Here's what the Bible said. The fear of man bringeth a snare. I've got no buddies when I get in this pulpit. There's no favorites when I get in this pulpit. If it's right, it's right. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Doesn't matter who it is. I'm so sick of these evangelists running around talking about how hard they preach. You can listen to them preach 20 messages. They never preach against anything, but they're always talking about how they stand for God. And all they want to talk about is, I'm a fundamentalist, I'm a fundamentalist, I'm a fundamentalist. And you know what a fundamentalist is? It was a bunch of Protestant baby sprinkling Calvinists in England. That's who started fundamentalism. That's why we don't use that statement here. I'm a Bible believer. And bless God, if that ain't good enough for you, then you need to find another church. You're not putting a bunch of tags on me and tell me where I got to go. I'm not a puppet. You're not going to control me and put strings on me. And I'm not shutting my mouth because you and your buddy don't like it. Oh, I know some pastors, they used to preach it tight and right and rough. Now they're in full-time evangelism. And bless God, they're such compromisers now, they wouldn't preach against snakes if the church was full of them. Amen, that's exactly right. Let me talk about some of these young evangelists you all think are the big and upcoming things. Let me tell you what I know about some of them young evangelists. They'll come to your church and hoop and holler and shout and talk about a good time. Then they go home and take their oxycodone and lay half drunk in their motels and their campers all weekend, taking prescription medicine. I know what I'm talking about, them and their wives. But nobody wants to say anything about it, see? If it's a Catholic, we'll say it. If it was Joel Osteen, we'd say it. If it was T.D. Jakes, we'd say it. But because it's one of your buddies, you don't want anybody saying it. I got news. I'm saying it, and I'll say it again. For the sake of our children, somebody needs to be saying it. Oh, yes, I know.